Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's video was provided by James CJ with some help from Karl. So why not show them some love in the comments while you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical places and the people that made them famous. Let's get to it. To outsiders looking in, Britain is kind of weird when it comes to politics. Like, they have a king who in theory wields a ridiculous amount of power, but said king confers most of his authority to a prime minister. In regards to the prime minister, they are elected by their respective party to lead, and a public vote decides on which party has a majority rule. But we're not done, because technically the king needs to appoint the prime minister, and if they really wanted to, could veto what is essentially the diplomatically agreed upon decision of who should rule, dissolve parliament, and install a puppet leader through whom they could lead the nation with an iron fist, using their near total and unchecked power to do pretty much whatever they damn well felt like. Known technically as a constitutional monarchy, this system seems to work well enough for Britain, and perhaps the most enduring symbol of this delicate balance between the monarch and the will of the people is the Palace of Westminster, which is known officially as the Houses of Parliament and the Palace of Westminster, and will be referred to simply as Westminster for the rest of this video, largely because that's how it's commonly referred to in the UK, as Karl has told me, and also because saying the Palace of Westminster every single time would get really old really fast. As Westminster is a unique building in the nation's history, serving as noted as almost a bridge between two versions of one of the world's most powerful nations, the UK monarchy and parliament. For most of the UK's history, it was ruled over by kings and queens. Over centuries, the monarch's power came into question, and by 1649, civil war broke out with the king at the time, King Charles I, who was executed. Finally, in 1689, it was declared in the country's Bill of Rights that Parliament held the power, not monarchs. In its early history, the Palace of Westminster was a royal residence and the unofficial home of Parliament. When the palace was abandoned in 1512, Parliament officially took up residence. Over centuries, disasters, wars, and development, Westminster has become synonymous with the government of the UK, while amassing a rich history and ties to the monarch. The earliest history of Westminster, or at least the buildings that preceded it and served basically the same purpose built on roughly the same patch of land, is murky. Some believe the origins of the building go all the way back to King Canute, one of Britain's earliest and most legendary kings, famously being the first Viking king to rule over the whole of England. As an aside, this video may frequently use Britain and England interchangeably. For the sake of simplicity, they're basically the same thing as far as this particular topic goes. Please ignore this disclaimer if you happen to be Scottish, Irish, or Welsh. Now, it's believed that the earliest versions of Westminster resided on Thorney Island, which itself was formed by the meeting of two rivers, the Tyburn and the Thames, where it was believed that Canute initially used the site as a royal dwelling during his reign in the early 11th century. The first literal concrete evidence we have of a building on the land where modern Westminster stands came during the rule of the guy who succeeded Canute, Edward the Confessor, who began building a palace on the site around the mid-11th century. It's unclear why Thorney Island was chosen to hold such an important place, as long before anything was built there, the Romans knew the island was a terrible place to build anything, as the whole area frequently flooded. It was also lousy with bramble bushes, hence the name Thorney Island. This said, Roman relics have occasionally been found in the area, ranging from tiles to sarcophagi, suggesting that despite the island's reputation, something must have been built there. Or maybe they just didn't like that one particular guy, we really don't know. Hell, even one of the rivers that form the island Westminster now stands on, the Tyburn, no longer exists, with the river now being part of London's sewer system. Moving swiftly on to medieval times, Westminster was the principal royal residence during this period, while Parliament operated in the palace's Westminster Hall, with the first official Parliament of England meeting at Westminster in 1265. As mentioned, our early understanding of Westminster is obscured. We don't know exactly what it initially looked like, but we know that monarchs who resided in the palace added to the existing structure. In 1512, King Henry VIII abandoned Westminster in favor of the Palace of Whitehall. Despite this move, Westminster technically remained a royal palace with the title. Westminster then became the permanent home to Parliament, despite the palace remaining, well, a palace. For centuries following this move, control of the palace and its precincts fell to the Great Lord Chamberlain, an official representative of the monarch. This didn't change until 1965, when Parliament and the Crown agreed to take control of the palace out of the Lord of Chamberlain's purview and shift it to the key representatives of both houses of Parliament. Lord Chamberlain retained control of Westminster Hall and St. Mary Undercroft, both of which are parts of the overall palace. Overall, the Palace of Westminster's early history wasn't all that eventful. During the centuries as a royal residence, the Houses of Parliament met in the palace together before the House of Lords and House of Commons began meeting separately. The House of Lords met in the Queen's Chamber, a modest medieval hall, while the House of Lords initially met at Westminster Abbey in the Chapter House. This was the case until Westminster Palace held dedicated chambers for each chamber of Parliament. In 1834, a tragedy would put the very existence of the Palace of Westminster into question. On October 16th, a simple trash disposal turned into a raging fire. By all accounts, the fire was nothing more than a careless accident. It started when the Exchequer, a former government office that collected revenue and made payments, audited official accounts, and tried all revenue-related legal cases, was tasked with getting rid of 2 cartloads of wooden tally sticks, which were used during the Middle Ages as a form of receipt for government income. Tally sticks had long been outdated to the Exchequer, having not been used since 1826. It was the decision of the Clerk of Works to just burn them in the underfloor stoves that existed in the House of Lords' basement, handing off this task to a pair of Irish laborers. At no point did it seem to occur to anyone present how monumentally stupid this idea was, by which we mean burning wood in a furnace meant for coal, not asking an Irish person to do the job. You see, while coal burns much hotter than wood, the latter burns with a flame, which dynamic Irish duo tasked with burning the tally sticks addressed by simply leaving the furnace door open. Possibly the worst thing they could have done, since this just drew in more oxygen, literally fanning the flames. As a result, the flames not only escaped the furnace, licking the walls and wooden floor above, but shot up the chimney far enough for it to catch on fire. Not that either man seemed to care, continuing to toss tally sticks into the furnace until clocking out time rolled around. At which point, they tossed in the last of the sticks, slammed the furnace door shut, and went to the pub. A move that we can't help but admire and firmly cements the men usually identified as Joshua Cross and Patrick Furlong as absolute legends in the prestigious field of not giving the remotest whiff of a To be clear, we like Cross and Furlong. They were literally just doing their jobs after all, and it's not like they knew that the furnace wasn't suitable for burning wood. Likewise, there was no way they could know that as they were burning the sticks, the flames were shooting up the chimney, melting away the copper lining and causing other parts of the building to randomly burst into flames. The same can't be said for everyone else present in Parliament that day, with multiple people noticing things that any reasonable person would chalk up to the building they were in being on fire. For example, at the same time Cross and Furlong were getting their burn on, the deputy housekeeper, Mrs. Wright, was hosting a party of visitors in the House of Lords, and noticed the floors were heated and smoke was seeping through the floorboards. Despite this, the work continued and nobody went to investigate where the smoke was coming from. Likewise, 2 guys who were visiting Westminster to see some fancy tapestries that hung there found themselves unable to do so because thick, choking smoke had completely obscured them. In addition, both men reported feeling an intense heat coming from the floor fierce enough to cause discomfort through their thick leather boots. Again, nobody thought this was suspicious, and at 5 p.m. pretty much everyone inside Westminster stopped what they were doing and went to the pub. At 6 p.m., panic set in when the wife of a doorkeeper alerted Mrs. Wright to the fact that the House of Lords had somehow caught on fire. While we don't know for sure what happened, it can be assumed the fire fierce enough to reach through the floorboards of the room above probably caught a curtain or something, and the fire spread from there. Before long, almost all of Westminster was aflame. On the streets surrounding Westminster, onlookers watched as the fire engulfed one of London's most important buildings. Soldiers kept the crowds at bay while firefighters attempted to control the fire, which was now out of control. In the end, both houses of Parliament were destroyed, along with various parts of the palace used for records, meetings, artifacts, and several residential rooms. Among the survivors of the Great Fire were the Jewel Tower, the cloisters and chapter house of St. Stephen's, the Undercroft Chapel, and Westminster Hall. It was claimed by Caroline Shenton of the Parliamentary Archives of 1834 that despite warning signs of the fire, they were largely ignored by the careless clerk of workers and a senile housekeeper in Mrs. Wright. The Irish lads, of course, got away scot-free. This led to Prime Minister Lord Melbourne declaring the disaster one of the greatest instances of stupidity upon record. Something that actually makes it kind of amazing that despite all of the ineptitude displayed by those present that day and the fact the fire burned for 5 straight days, nobody died as a result of the Great Fire. Fortunately, thanks to thick stone walls, a change in wind direction, and the arrival of the London Fire Engine Establishment's barge-mounted fire engine, they were able to begin quelling the flames and, most importantly, saving Westminster Hall. In the ashes of the Palace of Westminster came the question, what now? King William IV offered Parliament to relocate to a new location. His suggestion? None other than Buckingham Palace. King William IV disliked the residence and was essentially looking for any excuse to dispose of it. Parliament ultimately rejected the proposal, with MPs describing Buckingham Palace as dingy. Reminder, this is the place where a man with a £1 million hat lives. Due to Westminster Palace's history, it was decided to rebuild. The first immediate need of Westminster's rebuilding was to provide a place for the House of Lords and Commons to resume their parliamentary duties. Robert Smirke, who designed the British Museum, was brought on for this task by PM Melbourne. The House of Lords used the Painted Chamber, a remnant of Henry III's rule, originally a private apartment that was long and narrow. The Great Fire gutted the Painted Chamber, and with it went countless art pieces. It was re-roofed and refurbished to be used by the Lords as their temporary home before being demolished in 1851. The House of Commons used the Lesser Hall, a 12th century remnant of Westminster, to go between the residence and public seat of government during the palace's time as a royal residence. Robert Smirke was requested as the architect by Melbourne, and while he was ultimately appointed, it wouldn't last long. There were growing calls for an open competition to design a new palace. In April 1835, Smirke was ousted, and an open competition commenced, with Charles Barry ultimately winning. Of course, Barry wasn't alone. While Westminster Palace largely succumbed to the Great Fire in 1834, it was only in 1840 that construction on the new Westminster began. Barry estimated the project would take 6 years at a cost of £724,986, which today would be estimated to be just shy of £62 million. Anyone who knows anything about government-funded public works projects rarely meets the initial estimates in terms of time and cost. Indeed, the Palace of Westminster was no exception. Instead, it took nearly 30 years to complete and ballooned to a cost of £2 million, which today would be nearly £171 million. For the mammoth task of rebuilding Westminster Palace, Barry worked with fellow architect Augustus Pugin, with whom he'd worked on the original plan submitted for the open contest. There's a prevailing debate that Pugin perhaps deserves more credit than Barry. This argument largely stems from the two architects' distinct styles. Barry was known as a classical architect, while Pugin was known as a Gothic architect. Westminster Palace famously uses a perpendicular Gothic style. What we do know is that Barry relied on Pugin a great deal when it came to the execution of their plans, as Pugin appeared to be a more detail-oriented architect than Barry. This was particularly the case regarding fittings, furnishings, and detailing. It might be that Barry had the grand vision and contributed heavily to the overall aspects of Westminster's redesign, while Pugin was primarily responsible for detailing the palace. Both are essential tasks. Rebuilding Westminster Palace was by no means easy. One of Barry's early challenges was the decision to use sand-colored limestone. Unfortunately, problems with the limestone became abundantly clear not even a decade later. Remember, 19th century London is industrialized London. The city was heavily polluted at the time due to the burning of coal, which ended up showing on the limestone, which wasn't of the highest quality in the first place. This problem was noted in 1849, but nothing was done to remedy the problem until the 20th century when, in the 1920s, the problem became impossible to ignore, with pieces of Victoria Tower literally crumbling apart, creating a safety hazard for people entering and leaving the building. And, we don't think we could come up with a more apt metaphor for how politicians tend to serve their own interests rather than those of the public than politicians ignoring an issue that was literally on their doorstep until it could have potentially, literally, once again, impacted them. Anyway, in the 1930s, restoration began with the decayed limestone being replaced with Clipsham stone. It was halted during the Second World War and only completed in 1960. Unfortunately, the end result makes Westminster Palace look like a patchwork quilt. The interior of the palace is just as audacious as its exterior. All the decadence one sees from the outside is only magnified on the inside. In Westminster Palace, roughly 1,100 rooms, 100 staircases, and nearly 5 kilometers of passageways exist. The palace even includes estate apartments for members of parliament, bars, committee rooms, and of course the 2 chambers of parliament. The House of Lords features plush red benches and intense detail in a room finished with stained glass windows. The sovereign's throne completes the House of Lords and is where the monarch at the time sits during the state opening of Parliament every year. The monarch enters from the Victoria Tower entrance, known as the Sovereign's Entrance, and visits several rooms before going to the House of Lords. They deliver a speech written by the government outlining policies, proposed legislation, and ultimately opening Parliament. The House of Commons was a simple chamber with black leather benches and less ornate details. Of course, today, it's been simplified even further after being rebuilt in the 1940s following its destruction during a raid. Today, the House of Commons is filled with green benches and is far less detailed than its predecessor. Compared to most of Westminster Palace, it's one of the plainer rooms. Also, because we kind of have to mention this, yes, there's a bar inside Westminster, and it has become something of a lightning rod for public ire in recent years. In particular, because the MPs that it serves enjoy arguably the cheapest prices available anywhere in the capital, with a pint of beer selling for less than £3 in Strangers, one of the bars serving MPs. For comparison's sake, even the bar in London would charge about double that. Couple this with the fact MPs can also get a 3-course meal for less than the cost of a cheeseburger at one of the several eateries inside Westminster, and you can see why some members of the public would be annoyed. Also, MPs are notorious for charging pretty much everything and anything they can to the public coffers, which led to what became known as the expense scandal, during which it was revealed MPs weren't above charging the public purse for everything from charitable donations to moats for their second homes. But that is a story for another day. One of the defining features of the Palace of Westminster is its iconic towers: the Elizabeth Tower, Central Tower, and the Victoria Tower. Most people start with the Elizabeth Tower because it's home to one of the most famous clocks in the world, referred to as Big Ben, which is technically the name of the bell inside the clock tower. And we've got a video on that on this channel that you can check out, hosted by my buddy Karl. At 98.5 meters tall, the Elizabeth Tower is the second tallest of the 3 towers, starting construction in September of 1843. Of course, as a result of Big Ben, it's taken on a life of its own, acting almost as its own landmark that just happens to be attached to another. The Victoria Tower is the tallest of the 3 towers at 98.5 meters. Initially, the tower's purpose was to serve as a royal entrance and a location for Parliament records. Today, it's home to the Parliament Archives. The entrance was always intended for the monarch. As a result, it has a particularly decadent design, with sculptures and carvings adorning both the interior of the tower and its underside. Between 1990 and 1994, the tower was restored, replacing roughly 28.3 cubic meters of decayed stonework and having stonemasons recarve over 100 shields. The central tower is unique in that it's the only one of the 3 towers not to be included in the original plans for the palace's reconstruction by Charles Barry. Numerous MPs wanted the central lobby to act as a ventilation system for Westminster by using a chimney in the form of a tower. At the MP's insistence, the central tower was constructed above the central lobby, using the design of David Reed, the ventilator of the House of Commons. Charles Barry used the tower's existence to improve the overall palace's exterior design further, making it a spire to stand out amongst the lateral tower designs of Victoria and Elizabeth Towers. Unfortunately, in the end, the tower didn't work out the way many MPs or Reed had hoped. The central tower at 91 meters, while beautiful with its octagonal design, did little to achieve its intended practical purpose. Instead of filtering out the stale air in favor of fresh air, it allowed a cacophony of smells to enter the building, like the smell of cooking from the Speaker's kitchen and horses from a yard in the complex. Barry and Pugin never actually got to see the finished palace of Westminster. In 1852, Augustus Pugin died after spending a short period in the Bedlam Asylum, which he'd been briefly committed to. Charles Barry died 8 years later in 1860. Charles Barry's son, Edward, took over the project after his father's passing and oversaw the next decade of construction, ultimately completing Westminster Palace. As previously mentioned, Westminster Hall was one of the few parts of the original palace to survive the Great Fire of 1834. It wasn't saved by an act of God, but by the efforts of numerous firefighters who were told to forget the rest of the structure, which was beyond saving, in an attempt to save the Great Hall. This part of Westminster is the oldest remnant of its earliest days, built during King William II's reign and completed after 2 years of construction in 1099. Much of what we see today in Westminster Hall is various additions made over the course of centuries, with the most prominent work being done in the hall during King Richard II's reign in the 14th century. In 1393, one of the most striking aspects of Westminster Hall came to be: the hammer beam roof. The roof has a unique design, especially for the time, that supports itself without needing pillars. This allows for a vast open space uninterrupted by pillars and columns, which is important for a place where so many important state occasions continue to be held. During the 20th century, additions were made to support the roof further through the use of new steel structure. Additionally, 10% of the timber was replaced using oak as old as Westminster Hall. Throughout its existence, Westminster Hall has been the venue for numerous important events, such as coronation feasts from 1170 to 1830, royal councils, and state ceremonies. From the late 13th century to 1882, the hall was also used as a law court where the monarch would sit in judgment. Along with Guy Fawkes, another famous trial at Westminster Hall was that of Scottish resistance leader William Wallace in 1305 in King Charles I, who was tried for crimes of waging war against Parliament and the people in 1649. Finally, a use case that still exists today is when monarchs lie in state, with Queen Elizabeth II being the last monarch to lie in state when she passed in 2022. The hall itself doesn't feature any artwork on the walls, but does have decorative features reminding visitors of Westminster Hall's royal history through statues, carvings in each of the frame bases, and statues carved of nondescript medieval kings, all a product of the late 14th century refurbishment. There have been a few security incidents at Westminster Palace throughout its history, which isn't surprising considering its significance. One of the more well-known security incidents at Westminster was the infamous gunpowder plot. It was November 1605 when devout English Catholic Robert Catesby organized the attempted assassination of King James I. The motivation behind the attempted assassination was disdain towards King James I, who was Protestant. Catesby planned to assassinate the king and kidnap his 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, installing her as the puppet queen in hopes of establishing Catholic rule in England. When King James I ascended to the throne, many English Catholics believed he might usher in an era of religious freedom, or at least show more tolerance to Catholics than his predecessors. This belief was supported by the fact that King James I had appeared more sympathetic to English Catholics, and that his wife, Anne of Denmark, was herself a Catholic. All hope in King James I's attitude towards Catholics was decimated in early 1604 when he addressed the Parliament, stating he detested the Catholic faith. This declaration set the wheels of the gunpowder plot in motion. On May 20th, 1604, Catesby met with fellow conspirators to develop the plan. Then, with the help of Thomas Percy, a wealthy English Catholic, the gunpowder plot was funded and provided the use of the cellar directly under the House of Lords. The group placed barrels of gunpowder down there, which Guy Fawkes would ignite during the opening of Parliament. If this sounds oddly familiar to any Game of Thrones fans out there, yes, this is what they were referencing when Cersei blows up the Sept with wildfire. Back to reality. Ultimately, the plan failed. King James I was alerted to the plan before the opening of Parliament through an anonymous letter given to Lord Monteagle, warning him not to attend. Monteagle was likely warned as he was Catholic. However, Monteagle was also loyal to the king and warned him of a potential attempt on his life. The Loyalists searched Westminster Palace on November 4th, finding a cellar with large piles of firewood and Guy Fawkes. Fawkes narrowly avoided being suspected, and it wasn't enough to support the assassination attempt claims. King James ordered a second search on November 5th, and Fawkes was found again carrying matches and fuses and 36 barrels of gunpowder. He was also wearing a cape and boots with spurs, which most certainly didn't help. Fawkes was captured and tortured into giving up the names of co-conspirators, and in the end, Guy Fawkes was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a particularly barbaric death sentence in which the accused was dragged by horse to the execution venue, hung but not to death, disemboweled, beheaded, and then quartered by tying the four limbs of the guilty to different horses before spurring them in different directions. Today, Fawkes' image and name is often linked to anarchist movements or evoked by those who oppose government overreach. This was no doubt popularized by the film V for Vendetta and the graphic novel on which it is based, in which the title character V wears a stylized Guy Fawkes mask. The irony here being that Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament specifically in an attempt to usher in a Catholic theocracy. Anyway, in Britain, specifically November 5th is celebrated as Guy Fawkes Night, or more informally as either Bonfire or Fireworks Night. And as the name suggests, sees people letting off fireworks as a symbolic screw you to Fawkes. At more traditional gatherings, an effigy of Fawkes, known simply as a Guy, is usually burned on the bonfire before this takes place. The foiled gunpowder plot was far from the only security incident at the Palace of Westminster. For starters, before the burning of Parliament on May 11, 1812, Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated by John Bellingham, a Liverpool merchant adventurer, in the lobby of the House of Commons. Bellingham was wrongly imprisoned in Russia and believed the British government owed him compensation as a result. Bellingham was hanged for the crime, and Perceval remains to this day the only prime minister to ever be assassinated. In 1885, Westminster Palace was targeted by the Fenians. The group was part of the Irish Nationalist Secret Society. During the Troubles in Ireland from 1968 to 1998, relations between the UK and Northern Ireland were tense, to put it mildly. Roman Catholic nationalists wanted the Northern Ireland to become a part of the Republic of Ireland, but the UK did not. The Fenians were just one of the many groups that popped up during this period with the goal of disrupting and fighting against British rule in Ireland. One of their demonstrations took them straight to Westminster, where the group placed bombs in both the Chapel of St. Mary Undercroft and the Commons Chamber. The explosions caused extensive damage to the two parts of Westminster. The Mary Undercroft bomb was moved outside by a police constable before becoming too hot to carry, causing him to drop it. But when it exploded, it shattered Westminster Hall's windows and damaged the chapel roof. The Commons Chamber was also greatly damaged, with oak fragments everywhere, along with the destruction of carpet, the elaborately carved oak wall beneath the gallery, and the Peers Gallery for guests of MPs nearly destroyed. During the 20th century, the Palace of Westminster nearly found itself in a similar position to that of 1834. During the Blitz on London, the Palace of Westminster was one of many buildings at risk of complete and utter destruction as bombs rained down on London from September 7th, 1940 to May 11th, 1941. During this period, the palace would be hit numerous times, with the most devastating of the attacks coming on May 10, 1941. Bombs rained from the sky and hit the Commons Chamber, starting a fire that spread to numerous parts of the palace and, more importantly, onto the roof of Westminster Hall. Just like in 1834, a decision had to be made on which part of Westminster Palace was going to be saved. Unsurprisingly, Westminster Hall was chosen. The Commons Chamber was destroyed, while the Lords' Chamber and Elizabeth Tower were damaged. On June 17, 1974, the Provisional IRA planted a bomb in Westminster Hall, which successfully exploded and resulted in a fire. The incident injured 11 people and caused extensive damage to the historic hall. Of course, there have also been smaller examples of unrest that have made their way to Westminster. In early 2004, the House of Commons had a glass screen installed to insulate the Strangers Gallery to ensure members of the House of Commons were safer. This was after several incidents, like the 1970s tear gas incident where someone protesting tear gas use in Ireland threw 2 cans onto the floor, sending 3 members of Parliament to the hospital. It was considered one of the most violent attacks at Westminster Palace since the assassination of Prime Minister Perceval in 1812. Thanks to a rich history spanning nearly 1,000 years, the Palace of Westminster earned the title of UNESCO World Heritage Site, welcoming over 1 million visitors a year, with 1.6 million people visiting the palace in 2023. In the 21st century, efforts have been undertaken to refurbish the palace. In 2017, work began to repair the Elizabeth Tower and upgrade Big Ben. The project was considered one of the most complex and largest conservation efforts in the Elizabeth Tower's history, repairing existing damage from 1941's Blitz and the decades that followed. Considering the beating the palace took during the Second World War, many have called on Parliament to act and repair the crumbling Palace of Westminster. Experts have stated that due to the lack of proper refurbishment since the 19th century, the risk posed to the palace by fires and falling masonry continues to grow daily. Of course, the non-existent progress made on the palace beyond the Elizabeth Tower doesn't come from ignoring the problem, but from an inability to agree on what to do about it, and also a deficit of political willpower to throw any weight behind what is likely to be a massive spending bill to fund the project. After nearly 1,000 years of surviving a tragic fire and 2 world wars, Westminster might fall, ironically, due to the very parliament it serves. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment to your favorite historical site in Britain, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical places. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.